Hello, and welcome to another one of our lessons dealing with moments with the Master. This is a series that we've been exploring, taking primarily from the book of John, in which we're tracing the growing relationship between Jesus and the apostles that he chose to follow him. Whenever we think about the unfolding of events with these men, we take some primarily simple fishermen and see them grow to come to an understanding that truly Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. After he had called them to follow him, they grew in their devotion and in their love and adoration of Jesus. They watched him in John chapter 2 turn water into wine. And it says there in John 2 and verse 11 that his disciples believed on him. They realized this was someone extremely unique and unusual. They went with him to his first Passover observance in Jerusalem and watched him make a scourge out of small cords and to cleanse the temple as he drove out those money changers. Truly, this was a bold man who was willing to take a stand for that which was good and right. Whenever the Jews challenged him about what he did, they heard him say, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Now, the Jews never understood what that meant. They simply thought he was talking about that physical building that had taken some 46 years to build and to renovate under Herod. But later on, it says over in John chapter 2, farther down in that chapter, that the disciples later remembered what Jesus said and remembered that it was an application to his body that would be resurrected on the third day. They were probably there in John chapter 3 when Nicodemus came to him by night, and they heard him instruct this man that you must be born again. But at any rate, they watched the crowds continue to grow. Greater and greater groups were following Jesus. In fact, the observation was made that he soon had more disciples, more followers, than John the Baptist did over in John chapter 4. And looking at the very first verse, we find then that Jesus healed the nobleman's son in John chapter 4, and the disciples were also there to witness what happened with his interaction with the woman at the well and with those Samaritans from that village. Here they are seeing Jesus is not a respecter of persons. Here is a man that possesses power, even then to heal the nobleman's son who was some 24 miles away. Well, in John chapter 5, where we pick up today, we find that Jesus has gone back to Jerusalem for yet another feast. And while he and the apostles are in town, they go by the Pool of Bethesda, it's called, in John chapter 5, verses 2 through 4, where many individuals who had physical ailments would be laid. They would stay there, and on occasion an angel would come down and trouble the water. And the first one who could get into the water would be healed from whatever the problem was that they had. Now, there was a man lying there who had been an invalid for some 38 years, we're told in verse 5. And so this man wanted to be healed, and he was there by the water, but not yet had received a healing. And Jesus simply asked him in verse 6 of John chapter 5, he said, "Wilt thou be made whole? Do you really want to be better?" And of course the man said yes, but then he says, and he begins to offer the excuse as to why he wanted to be made well, but he just wasn't sure it was going to happen. Because there was always somebody who could get to the water ahead of him. There was nobody to put him in the water. There's first this excuse, and then there's that excuse. I guess I'm just stuck in the situation that I'm in. Jesus just looked at him and said, "Take up your bed and walk." Now, this was shocking information to this man, I'm sure. But he did as Jesus commanded. He took up that bed, and he was immediately made whole, it says in verse 9. So as he's carrying his bed back home, as Jesus has commanded him to do, there are some Jews seeing him carry that bed, and they became offended because it was the Sabbath day. And you're not allowed to do any work on the Sabbath day. And you're carrying your bed on the Sabbath day. And the man said, "Well, the fella who made me well told me to take up my bed and walk, and that's exactly what I'm doing." Well, later on, this man saw Jesus and in the city and made known to the Jews that that's the fellow that made me well. And whenever they found out about that, then they directly challenged Jesus about how dare he heal a man on the Sabbath day and tell him to take up his bed and walk. You clearly don't understand much about the Sabbath day observances. Here's a man who's been unable to walk for 38 years. And Jesus has made him well. But instead of rejoicing over that, being amazed at the power of Jesus and what he had just accomplished for this man, they began to nitpick. They began to say, but it's a Sabbath day, and you've got to do just certain limited things on the Sabbath day, and you're in violation of the Sabbath day. Truly, as Jesus analyzed their behavior over in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 14, he said, you truly are blind leaders of the blind. They could not see the power of God demonstrated. They could not see the goodness of Jesus. They simply looked for things to criticize. And this becomes a pattern for them that the apostles will witness throughout Jesus' ministry, that they are going to criticize and be hardened against him regardless what he does, and that hatred will one day result in Jesus being nailed to a cross. We hope that you'll think about the greatness of Jesus and the power that he displays, and that you, like the apostles, can grow in your appreciation of Jesus, who he was, what he said, the power that he demonstrated, and truly the evidence that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And we hope that you'll find a chance to come as soon as we are able and assemble with us at the Eubank Church of Christ, where we can learn more about this marvelous man, Jesus, the Son of God.